Planning an Information Systems Audit. Information Systems Audit is there to provide reasonable assurance that the risk to information systems, and obviously then to business objectives, is being managed appropriately. We need to plan the audits in order to accomplish this goal. At the conclusion of the audit, we will prepare an audit report that addresses control issues and offers recommendations to management on what could be done to sort of improve then the effectiveness and appropriateness of our information systems operations and controls. The audit process itself requires the auditor to gather evidence. Once we have gathered the evidence, we will then use that to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the controls in place to protect the information systems based on that evidence which has been gathered. We will perform a series of different types of audit tests to test the effectiveness of controls, whether or not those are managerial, procedural, or technical controls. And once we have done the evaluation and tests, we will prepare an audit report for management. The audit process itself starts with, first of all, knowing what is the scope. What is going to be included in this audit? We have to have a clearly defined scope. There can be changes when, during an audit, because of a material finding, we may adjust the scope. However, we should start with a clearly defined audit plan, scope, and objectives. We formulate exactly what we want to prove through this audit. For example, an audit may be designed to try to prove that we have adequate controls in place to protect financial transactions, or say expense reports. And then we would formulate an audit objective that says that we will ensure that the controls in place are adequate to prevent fraud and ensure then the correct operation then of expense reports. We then need to define and identify the audit criteria. When we do this, we'll look at what is a pass and what is a failure. We'll look at what, from the organization's perspective, would be the areas that we need to examine and look at, and what the expected results of that would be. Now that we have the audit planned out, we will look at the actual audit procedures, the step-by-step actions we'll use in gathering the evidence, testing the controls, doing the analysis, and ensuring that we have the correct information in order to deliver a report. This means that we've gathered, hopefully, an acceptable amount of work evidence and work papers that can be used to ensure that we can appropriately measure the effectiveness of the controls, looking at areas such as compliance, risk, and fraud, for example. The auditor is expected to be a skilled expert, where they not only gather the evidence, but are able then to review and evaluate it in such a way that they can form audit conclusions. Based on the evidence, audit feels that. And so we put together a conclusion that what we have determined, the auditor opinion about then the adequacy of the control, and whether or not we had met the original audit objectives that we formulated earlier. Then we'll sit down with the process owners, or the auditees. We'll talk to them about the results of the audit, what we have gathered, what our conclusions and opinions are, and what our possible recommendations might be. When we review this with the process owners, they have the ability to respond. They can agree with our recommendations, or in some cases they may not. They may also point out where we've made an incorrect evaluation, and we might need to adjust the information that is in the original or draft audit report. Once the audit then has been revised and management's comment or the process owner's comments have been included in response to our conclusions and opinions, the audit now will be distributed to management. The distribution of the audit will be according to the provisions within the audit charter. Who should receive a copy of this audit? And very often we will have both an executive summary as well as a more detailed part of the audit. Some areas, such as senior management, may only receive the executive summary. It's important that an audit has proper project management. The problem always is the audit may run into problems with time, budget, availability, and good project management is essential to ensure the effectiveness of then the audit process. When we plan the audit engagement, we must be aware of any risks that could be associated with this project. For example, are there certain skills that would be necessary in order to accomplish this audit? Another risk associated with the audit could be the lack of availability or lack of cooperation from management. Could be that there's other projects ongoing that could impact the level of accuracy of the audit in the end. We understand the risk. We plan our engagement in a way to hopefully be most likely to have a successful result. Now we build the audit plan. We define the actual activities and tasks, the timelines. We define the resources that would be necessary. For example, specialized resources may be necessary in some audits. We also, for example, ensure that the business unit is aware and would be available once we need to reach out to them and, of course, capture information from them. Once we have the plan, we move on to the execution. We execute all of the tasks that we had defined, the various types of tests and data gathering initiatives. And then, as the audit progresses, monitor it to make sure that the audit remains on track, that we are moving ahead, and if there are any problems then in the actual audit plan, they are being identified and can be addressed as early as possible in order to get the audit back on track and hopefully towards a successful conclusion. We need to watch the budget and time management, and we have to be aware of and able to respond to any challenges that may arise during the audit, for example, from a lack of access to certain critical information. The idea of the audit objectives is to meet the goals in the audit plan. We set out our audit plan based on, of course, our audit charter. We want to ensure that we have clearly can meet the objective of the audit as we then conduct it. A big part of then doing an audit of controls will be to ensure that we have put in place the right controls, that the controls have been implemented as designed, and those controls are functioning correctly. In most cases, when we conduct an audit, the audit plan and audit objectives will be to ensure that we have the correct controls and they're doing what they are supposed to do. The goals of audit: to ensure, in many cases, we have compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. We have met the needs of security and function of our information and information technology resources, such as we've ensured we've protected sensitive information from breaches of confidentiality and/or integrity. We've understood when we have critical systems, systems that must be available in order to support business operations, we've also then ensured the availability of both the information we require and the IT resources and systems necessary to then support or provide that. We then will review both system-specific controls, the controls that were put in place for this system, as well as then the general controls that apply across the entire organization. When we measure and want to audit those controls, we will then translate the objective and purpose of that control into a specific audit activity. We ensure that that control is working by defining the test strategy. How can I then translate the objective of the control into a way to measure the effectiveness of that control? An example then of auditing a control. Say, for example, if you're going to audit a financial transaction, you would ensure that that transaction was posted accurately into the general ledger of the organization. We would ensure that there were appropriate controls in place to try to detect an error and alert if incorrect information was input, such as hash values and integrity checks, the number of transaction checks, for example. We would ensure that in order to prevent fraud, as well as to try to prevent errors, that we have adequate separation of duties, that no one controls an entire transaction on their own from its initiation to its completion, but rather we break that transaction into several different parts, and we ensure that different people execute different parts of that transaction. This process of mutual exclusivity and separation of duties is essential, especially when we're dealing with financial transactions. We want to ensure that we have the correct controls in place to prevent errors or prevent serious or material weaknesses in the processing of a financial transaction. This will quite often include areas such as having a maximum value control on a transaction. A person that wanted to implement a payment would only be allowed to implement or input that payment up to a certain registered amount. We have a maximum value of that transaction. If the transaction exceeded that level, it should be then stopped and approval would be needed from another more serious person. We want to also audit to make sure that anytime there is an error, that error is first of all detected, but then goes through a correct handling process as well. Very often in financial transactions, this is where we find frauds and mistakes. The fact that 99% of all transactions process correctly, but 1% had errors. And very often when we have the correct processing, we have the separation of duties. However, in the error handling, quite often we see that maybe the error was not handled correctly, it was not isolated and identified. In other cases, the person who can then correct that error is able to actually correct it without separation of duties, which could lead to fraud. Error handling is something that the auditor must always pay a special attention to when they're auditing a financial transaction. We also want to make sure that every transaction was processed. We have then completeness. If we had 1,000 payments, that at the end of the day, we can see that 1,000 payments were entered into the system. A few didn't get lost somewhere along the way. There are a number of different types of audits then we will perform. For example, we have just discussed financial audits, which can assess the accuracy and completeness of financial reporting, but we'll very often also do compliance audits. In today's world of regulations and laws, we quite often have laws that we must demonstrate we are compliant then with privacy law, healthcare law, and in the case of then industry standards, contractual requirements such as, for example, PCI DSS. The payment card industry data security standard sets out then how a merchant must then handle payment cards, whether or not they're credit cards or debit cards, in order to minimize the risk of credit card theft. We are required to be able to demonstrate that our systems are compliant with both laws as well as standards. We also will evaluate operational activities. We will ensure that our internal control structure, such as least privilege and separation of duties, is in fact working and properly implemented. We will then check things, as we looked at a moment ago, such as maximum values of a financial transaction. That means we are going to test the effectiveness of those controls that were built into the application to prevent a user from being able to put in some type of transaction that exceeds their authorized level. We quite often will do an integrated audit, a combination of several different types of audits done together. For example, we could do a financial audit to check the accuracy of financial statements, but combine that with an operational control review to make sure that the operations and support of those financial systems was also being done properly. Were those financial systems being backed up? Did we have proper access controls? Those would normally be called operational controls. We could also do administrative audits. We look at, for example, with a project, is this project on schedule, on budget? Is this project seriously in danger of not delivering what the business had expected and paid for? So when we do an administrative audit, we are going to look at the efficiency then of resource management and project management. Make sure that the capital expenses we have are delivering what we expected. Make sure that the resources we have are being used effectively, certainly in the administration of our systems. We will also perform information systems audits. This is where we'll look at both the general as well as the system-specific controls to ensure that those controls are appropriate. They are supporting the business requirements, but also would be effective to prevent, detect, or then correct some type of undesirable event. In some cases, we will be required to do a specialized audit. A specialized audit is often done by a third party. When I have a supply chain dependency, and I have an organization such as a cloud provider who's providing then the hosting of my data and applications, I want to ensure that that cloud provider is following good information security practices. What we will do, therefore, is we will have them provide us a review by their third-party auditors that ensure then that they are meeting those requirements, and these are often done through an older report known as a SAS 70, but today is usually being done with a report known as the SSAE 16 or the ISAE 3402. When we have these reports conducted for us, they will provide a level of assurance that that supply chain partner is then meeting good practices in information security controls. We also can see different types of audits that are done under these specialized audit criteria. Audits that are a type 2 audit are going to be more in-depth and more detailed than, for example, a type 1 audit. One of the difficult areas of audit is always a forensics audit. Forensic is when we are discovering, disclosing, and following up on criminal activity. And in the case of forensics audits, we are doing the examination of evidence needed in the gathering of information about that potential criminal activity. The important thing when we are conducting any type of forensics audit is to ensure we've taken extreme measures to then protect the evidence. We ensure that that evidence will be protected through disciplines such as a chain of custody, and the protection of that evidence from unnecessary contamination so that it would be then admissible, if ever necessary, if this investigation ever went to a court of law. In summary, we develop an audit plan to ensure that we are doing the correct type of audit that will meet our audit objectives. We also ensure then that management is receiving accurate information, that the audit has provided management with a clear picture of whether or not the risk is being appropriately managed and whether or not the information system controls that we have in place were properly implemented, are being properly maintained, and are effective in mitigating risk.